December 19th, 1944. The morning cold bit through inadequate winter uniforms as paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division scraped frozen earth with entrenching tools, digging defensive positions in a rough circle around the Belgian crossroads town of Bastogne. These men had arrived only hours earlier after a desperate 100-mile truck convoy through freezing rain and darkness. Most wore the same jump smocks they had worn in Normandy 6 months before. Few possessed proper winter gear. Nearly none had slept in 48 hours. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 4 miles to the east, the lead elements of Panzer Lehr Division and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division moved steadily westward, their tank commanders confident in both their armour superiority and the weakness of the American forces ahead. German intelligence had confirmed what seemed obvious. Lightly armed paratroopers without organic armour, without heavy artillery, without adequate cold weather equipment, and without their commanding general, had somehow positioned themselves to defend a critical road junction. The German assessment was simple. Bastogne would fall within 24 hours. Perhaps the American airborne troops would fight initially with their characteristic stubbornness. But isolated, outnumbered 5-1, and lacking the heavy weapons necessary to stop panzer formations, their resistance would collapse once German armour began the assault. This calculation seemed mathematically certain. What German commanders failed to anticipate was that American doctrine had fundamentally reimagined how lightly armed airborne forces could fight when properly integrated with attached armour and artillery. The paratroopers digging foxholes in the frozen Belgian soil were not the isolated light infantry force German planning assumed. They were the centre of an improvised combined arms defence that would demonstrate something German military theory had not considered possible. Lightly armed troops, when supported by even minimal armour and properly coordinated artillery, could create defensive positions that heavy panzer divisions could not penetrate. The morning of December 19th would mark the beginning of a 7-day siege that shattered German confidence in armoured superiority and proved that American combined arms doctrine could transform numerical and material disadvantages into tactical victory. The paratroopers at Bastogne were about to teach the Wehrmacht a lesson in defensive warfare that would redefine how light infantry could fight against mechanized forces. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The events that placed the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne began 4 days earlier in circumstances that caught Allied command completely by surprise. On December 16, 1944, over 200,000 German troops and more than 1,000 tanks launched Operation Watch on the Rhine through the densely forested Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg. The offensive represented Adolf Hitler's final desperate gamble to reverse Germany's deteriorating strategic position by splitting Allied forces, capturing the vital Belgian port of Antwerp, and forcing the Western Allies into a separate peace that would allow Germany to concentrate all remaining strength against the advancing Soviet armies in the east. The German High Command selected the Ardennes specifically because Allied forces used this sector as a rest area for divisions bloodied in heavy fighting elsewhere, and as a quiet sector where new, inexperienced divisions could receive initial combat exposure. The American 8th Corps held an 88-mile front with only 3 infantry divisions. The 28th Infantry Division had suffered severe casualties in the recent Hurtgen Forest fighting. The 4th Infantry Division was similarly recovering from heavy losses. The 106th Infantry Division had arrived at the front just days earlier and had yet to see combat. German planners counted on several crucial assumptions. First, they believed the Allies possessed no strategic reserves on the European continent that could respond quickly to a breakthrough. Second, they anticipated that heavy cloud cover and winter storms would ground Allied air power, negating American air superiority for the critical opening days of the offensive. Third, and most fatally for German plans, they assumed that if they moved quickly enough to seize key road junctions before American forces could organize coherent defenses, the weakly held Ardennes front would collapse entirely. The architect of the southern thrust of the German offensive was General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army. Manteufel's forces were organized into several panzer corps, with General Heinrich von Luttwitz's 47th Panzer Corps designated as the spearhead that would capture Bastogne and open the roads to the Meuse River. Luttwitz commanded a powerful force. The 2nd Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr Division provided his armoured striking power, while the 26th Volksgrenadier Division would force river crossings and clear American strongpoints. Supporting these divisions were a Volks Mortar Brigade, a Volks Artillery Corps, and engineer battalions to construct bridges across the Auer and Clerf rivers. German operational orders were explicit regarding Bastogne. The town sits on a high plateau, at the convergence of 7 major highways and multiple secondary roads lacing through the heavily forested Ardennes, all roads suitable for mechanized forces moving westward toward the Meuse River passed, through or very near, Bastogne. Control of the town was therefore essential to German operational success. Manteuffel's instructions to Luttwitz stated that Bastogne was to be taken quickly, preferably by coup de main before American forces could organize a defense. If strong resistance developed, the panzer divisions were to bypass Bastogne to the north and south, while the 26th Volksgrenadier Division captured the town. This plan reflected standard German doctrine for mechanized warfare. Armour exploited breakthroughs and raced for operational objectives, while infantry divisions secured key positions and protected flanks. The assumption was that even if American forces somehow reached Bastogne before German armour completely surrounded it, those forces would be light infantry units without the heavy weapons necessary to stop panzer attacks. German commanders anticipated that any American troops reaching Bastogne would be quickly overwhelmed or forced to surrender when German armour isolated them. The German assessment of American airborne divisions shaped these calculations. German intelligence knew that American paratroop and glider infantry divisions were designed as light assault forces intended for brief operations behind enemy lines. They dropped or landed from aircraft with only the weapons and ammunition soldiers could carry, or that could be loaded into gliders. A standard American airborne division possessed organic artillery consisting of 75mm pack howitzers that could be broken down for parachute delivery. These provided fire support but lacked the range and hitting power of standard divisional artillery. For anti-tank defense, airborne divisions relied primarily on 57mm anti-tank guns that could be delivered by glider and man-portable bazookas. German planners understood that American airborne divisions lacked organic armour. They possessed no medium or heavy tanks. They had no tank destroyer battalions with the high-velocity guns necessary to engage German heavy armour at effective ranges. Their reconnaissance units operated on foot rather than in armoured vehicles. Their engineers lacked the heavy equipment that standard infantry divisions possessed. In every material measure, an American airborne division was vastly inferior to a German panzer division when fighting a sustained defensive action. This understanding led German commanders to dismiss the possibility that even elite American paratroopers could hold Bastogne, if isolated and surrounded by multiple panzer and Volksgrenadier divisions. The mathematics seemed overwhelming. A German panzer division in December 1944, even after months of fighting and the degradation of German industrial capacity, still fielded significant armour strength. The 2nd Panzer Division possessed approximately 130 tanks including Panthers and Mark IVs. Panzer Lehr Division, though reduced from earlier strength, still operated with roughly 50 tanks and numerous self-propelled guns. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division brought 3 infantry regiments with supporting artillery. Against this force, German intelligence assessed, the Americans might position at most a few thousand lightly armed paratroopers with minimal artillery and no armour. Even accounting for American fighting spirit and tactical skill, such a force could not sustain defence against coordinated armour and infantry attacks. German doctrine held that lightly armed forces without adequate anti-tank weapons and artillery support would be overrun by mechanized assault within hours or at most a day or two. The town would fall. The roads would open. The 5th Panzer Army would continue westward toward the Meuse. These German calculations failed to account for several critical factors that would transform Bastogne into the graveyard of their offensive ambitions. First, while American airborne divisions indeed lacked organic heavy weapons, American doctrine emphasized combined arms operations, where available armor and artillery assets were rapidly attached to units that needed them. Second, American forces possessed a mobile reserve that German intelligence had failed to properly assess. Third, and perhaps most importantly, American defensive doctrine had evolved significantly from early war experiences to emphasize coordinated artillery fire and the integration of all available combat power into mutually supporting defensive systems. On the evening of December 17th, as German forces were smashing through initial American defensive positions and racing westward, General Dwight Eisenhower met with his senior commanders to assess the developing crisis. The scale and violence of the German offensive had become unmistakably clear by this point. This was not a local counterattack or spoiling operation, but a major offensive employing multiple panzer and infantry divisions along a 50-mile front. Eisenhower immediately grasped that holding key terrain features would be essential to disrupting German operational plans. The road junctions at Bastogne and Saint-Vith were obvious critical points. Eisenhower ordered forward the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Forces Strategic Reserve. This consisted of two divisions, both airborne, the 82nd Airborne Division, commanded by Major General James Gavin, and the 101st Airborne Division, temporarily commanded by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, in the absence of Division Commander Major General Maxwell Taylor, who was in Washington. Both divisions were at Montmelon-le-Grand near Reims, France, recovering and refitting after their costly participation in Operation Market Garden in Holland during September. The orders were urgent: move without delay. The 82nd Airborne would deploy to the northern shoulder of the German penetration around Verbermont to block the advance of elite SS Panzer formations. The 100 and 1st Airborne would race to Bastogne to hold the critical road junction. Neither division had organic transport. Trucks had to be assembled from wherever they could be found. Many paratroopers would ride to battle in open trucks through winter storms. The movement began on the evening of December 17th and continued through December 18th. For the 101st, the journey covered over 100 miles through freezing rain, sleet, and darkness. The roads became increasingly crowded with military traffic moving in both directions. American units that had been overrun or forced to retreat streamed westward. Wounded soldiers, shattered equipment, and the unmistakable signs of defeated forces lined the route north. The paratroopers riding in open trucks through the storm could see clearly that they were moving toward a disaster in progress. The 101st Airborne Division that deployed to Bastogne was a veteran force, but one that had paid heavily for its experience. The division had jumped into Normandy on D-Day, June 6, 1944, seizing key objectives behind Utah Beach. It had fought through the hedgerow country in vicious close-quarters combat. It had deployed to Holland for Market Garden, the airborne operation intended to seize bridges and open a corridor into Germany. At Normandy, the division suffered over 4,000 casualties. Market Garden added another 3,600. The division that loaded into trucks for Bastogne had absorbed thousands of replacement soldiers who lacked the combat experience of the Normandy veterans, but who had been training with their units for months. Division organization in December 1944 consisted of 3 parachute infantry regiments, the 501st, 502nd, and 506th, plus the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, that arrived by glider rather than parachute, but fought as standard infantry. Each regiment fielded 3 battalions. Supporting these infantry units were the division artillery, consisting of 4 battalions, with pack howitzers, the 81st Airborne Anti-Aircraft Battalion, with anti-aircraft guns that could be used in ground support roles, the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion, and various support units including medical, signal, and quartermaster companies. What the division lacked in December 1944 was proper winter equipment. The men had deployed expecting rest and refitting, not immediate combat in winter conditions. Most possessed only the uniforms they wore. Winter overcoats, insulated boots, heavy gloves, and cold-weather sleeping bags were in short supply or non-existent. Many paratroopers wore the same jump smocks and wool uniforms they had worn in Normandy. These provided minimal protection against Belgian winter temperatures that regularly dropped below freezing. More critically for defensive operations, the division artillery had expended enormous quantities of ammunition during Market Garden and had not yet received full resupply. Ammunition stocks were lower than desired for sustained combat. The division possessed its standard allocation of bazookas and 57mm anti-tank guns, but lacked heavier anti-tank weapons. Against German Panther and Tiger tanks with their heavy frontal armour, these weapons required extremely close-range engagements or carefully aimed shots at weak points to be effective. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe commanded the division in the absence of Maxwell Taylor. McAuliffe was an artilleryman who had served as division artillery commander and had earned respect for his tactical judgment and calm demeanour under pressure. At 56 years old, he was older than many division commanders and possessed the experience that came from years of service. His temporary command of the division would be tested immediately upon arrival at Bastogne. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The lead elements of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment reached the division assembly area 4 miles west of Bastogne shortly after midnight on December 19th. By 9 in the morning, the entire division had closed into the area. They had arrived just 4 hours before German forces would begin surrounding the town. The race to Bastogne had succeeded, but only barely. Had the truck convoy been delayed even a few hours by traffic, weather, or any other factor, German forces would have seized the town before American troops arrived. McAuliffe quickly assessed the situation through coordination with Major General Troy Middleton, commander of 8th Corps, whose headquarters had been in Bastogne, but was now relocating westward as German forces approached. Middleton provided McAuliffe with the available intelligence. German armour and infantry were advancing from multiple directions. The 28th Infantry Division had fought desperately to delay the German advance, trading space for time, but had been forced to withdraw from positions east of Bastogne. Elements of the 10th Armoured Division, particularly Combat Command B, had been conducting delaying actions against German spearheads, but were being pressed back steadily. The mission was clear: hold Bastogne and deny the Germans the road network. How long would the 101st need to hold? Middleton could not say with certainty. Relief forces were being organised. General George Patton's Third Army was preparing to attack northward from its positions to the south, but Patton would need days to disengage from his current operations, pivot his entire army 90 degrees, and fight through German forces to reach Bastogne. The 101st would need to hold for at least several days, possibly a week or more. Immediately ordered his regiments to move out and establish defensive positions. The 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment moved southeast through Bastogne toward the villages of Magaret and Longvilly, where they would encounter German forces almost immediately. The 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment deployed northwest to block German approaches from that direction. The 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment took positions north of the town around the village of Noville. The 327th Glider Infantry Regiment spread along the southern and western perimeter. The division was establishing a circular defence, anticipating that German forces would attempt to surround and isolate Bastogne. This defensive deployment represented a fundamental break from traditional military doctrine. Conventional wisdom held that forces should never allow themselves to be surrounded. A surrounded force loses its supply lines, its ability to manoeuvre, and its option to withdraw if the situation becomes untenable. But McAuliffe understood that the mission required accepting encirclement. The value of Bastogne lay in denying the Germans the road network. That required holding the town, even if German forces bypassed it to the north and south. The 101st would dig in, establish strong defensive positions, and force the Germans to either attack frontally or leave significant forces behind to contain the American garrison. The critical unknown was whether the lightly armed paratroopers could actually stop German armour attacks. McAuliffe's calculations depended heavily on forces that were being attached to his command. Combat Command B of the 10th Armoured Division would remain in Bastogne to provide armoured support. This was not a full armoured division but a combat command, roughly equivalent to a reinforced regiment, consisting of tank battalions, armoured infantry, and supporting artillery. Even reduced by recent combat losses, Combat Command B brought approximately 40 tanks, including Shermans with 76mm guns, that could engage German armour effectively at moderate ranges. More critically, McAuliffe would have substantial artillery support beyond his organic division artillery. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion was ordered to Bastogne to provide mobile anti-tank capability with its self-propelled guns. 3 separate artillery battalions were already in the Bastogne area, including the 969th Field Artillery Battalion, an all-African-American unit equipped with 155mm howitzers. These heavy artillery pieces provided the firepower that light airborne divisions normally lacked. Additional engineer and support units in the area would be pressed into service as infantry to fill gaps in the defensive perimeter. The force assembling at Bastogne was therefore not simply a light airborne division, but an improvised combined arms task force. It possessed infantry, armour, tank destroyers, heavy artillery, anti-aircraft guns that could be used against ground targets, and engineers trained in both defensive construction and combat operations. The question was whether these diverse elements could be coordinated effectively in the limited time available before German attacks began. German forces were already probing American positions by midday on December 19th. Elements of Panzer Division encountered American defenders near the village of Neffe east of Bastogne. Combat Team Cherry of the 10th Armoured Division had established a roadblock and was fighting a delaying action against advancing German armour. The engagement was sharp but brief. German tanks destroyed several American vehicles, but were slowed by determined resistance. By evening, German commanders recognized that American forces had reached Bastogne in strength and were establishing defensive positions. General von Luttwitz faced a critical decision. His orders had been to capture Bastogne quickly or bypass it if strong resistance developed. The presence of American paratroopers and armour indicated that capturing the town would require significant combat. But bypassing Bastogne entirely meant leaving American forces in control of the road network, which would severely complicate German logistics and operational movement. Luttwitz decided on a compromise. He would detach sufficient forces to surround and eventually capture Bastogne while sending his main panzer formations westward toward the Meuse. On December 20th, the 2nd Panzer Division moved northwest of Bastogne, while Panzer Lehr Division passed to the south. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division closed in from the east and northeast. Additional forces, including the 901st Panzergrenadier Regiment from Panzer Lehr, remained to support the 26th Volksgrenadier in capturing the town. By the evening of December 20th, Bastogne was effectively surrounded, though the western sector remained thinly held by German forces and would not be completely sealed until December 21st. The American defenders now faced the situation German planners had anticipated. They were isolated, outnumbered roughly 5-1 by German forces surrounding them, cut off from direct ground supply lines, and facing repeated attacks by armour and infantry. German commanders expected the American position to collapse within 24 to 48 hours. Every factor favoured the Germans. They possessed superior numbers, heavier armour, and the initiative to attack where and when they chose. The Americans were confined to a perimeter roughly 8 miles in diameter, their backs to the town, with limited ammunition and supplies. What German commanders failed to anticipate was that the American force at Bastogne had been assembled and organized specifically for this type of defensive operation. The circular perimeter meant that artillery positioned in the center of the defense could fire in any direction with minimal displacement. The attached armour formed a mobile reserve that could move rapidly along interior lines to reinforce any threatened sector. The tank destroyers provided additional mobile anti-tank capability. The heavy artillery battalions brought firepower that could break up German concentrations before they reached American positions. Perhaps most importantly, American doctrine emphasized coordinated defensive fire, where artillery, mortars, tanks, tank destroyers, and infantry weapons all engaged attacking forces in a carefully integrated system. The siege of Bastogne would test whether this combined arms defensive doctrine could enable light infantry to defeat mechanized forces under the worst possible circumstances. The answer would come in the form of repeated German attacks over the following week, each designed to exploit American weakness, each broken by defensive firepower that German planners had not believed possible. The first major German assault came on the morning of December 20th, 1944, barely 24 hours after the 101st Airborne had completed establishing its defensive perimeter. German forces probed multiple sectors simultaneously, testing American defensive strength and seeking weak points that could be exploited. The pattern of these attacks revealed German tactical thinking. They anticipated that lightly armed paratroopers would break under sustained pressure from combined armor and infantry attacks. Near the village of Noville, north of Bastogne, Team de Sobry of the 10th Armored Division's Combat Command B fought a desperate engagement against elements of the 2nd Panzer Division. The American force consisted of a company of Sherman tanks, a company of armored infantry, and supporting units. German armor outnumbered them significantly. The fighting at Noville demonstrated what would become the pattern for the Noville people entire siege. American defenders used terrain to their advantage, positioning tanks in hull-down positions where only their turrets were exposed. They coordinated tank fire with infantry anti-tank weapons, particularly bazookas operated by paratroopers from the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Most critically, they called for artillery support from batteries positioned south of the town. The artillery fire proved devastating to German formations attempting to maneuver in the open ground around Noville. American forward observers directed fire from multiple artillery battalions simultaneously, creating concentrations of high-explosive shells that broke up German attacks before they could develop momentum. This was not the light resistance German commanders had anticipated. The defenders at Noville were employing sophisticated combined arms tactics that integrated armor, infantry, and artillery into a coordinated defensive system. By afternoon, German pressure had become so intense that American forces withdrew from Noville back to the main defensive perimeter. But this tactical withdrawal had cost the Germans an entire day of fighting and significant casualties in men and armor. The delay was critical. Every hour that German forces spent fighting for outlying positions was an hour. The main defensive perimeter grew stronger as engineers improved positions and artillery registered defensive fire zones. On December 21st, German forces completed the encirclement of Bastogne. All 7 roads leading from the town were now cut by German positions. The American garrison was isolated, with no direct ground connection to other Allied forces. German commanders assessed that the Americans now faced an untenable situation. Isolated forces historically surrendered when faced with overwhelming odds, limited supplies, and no hope of relief. The siege tactics that had worked for centuries would work at Bastogne. This calculation failed to account for American logistics and airlift capability. Even as German forces tightened their ring around Bastogne, American commanders were organizing an aerial resupply operation. The challenge was enormous. Bastogne was surrounded by German anti-aircraft units. The weather had been terrible since the offensive began, with heavy clouds, fog, and snow preventing Allied air operations. Without clear weather, transport aircraft could not locate drop zones or navigate accurately to the target. The defenders would have to hold with whatever supplies they possessed until weather improved sufficiently for air operations. Inside the perimeter, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Artillery ammunition stocks were the most critical concern. American defensive tactics depended heavily on massed artillery fire to break up German attacks. By December 22nd, artillery commanders were restricting fire to 10 rounds per gun per day, a fraction of normal expenditure rates. At this rate of consumption, some batteries would exhaust their ammunition entirely within days. Food supplies were also running low. The division had deployed on short notice with minimal rations. Medical supplies presented another crisis. Casualties were mounting, but morphine, plasma, bandages, and surgical supplies were in desperately short supply. The wounded presented particularly difficult challenges. Most medical personnel and supplies had been captured on December 19th, when German forces overran the division service area in a night raid. Makeshift aid stations were established in Bastogne's cellars, churches, and any buildings offering shelter. Belgian civilians assisted American medics in caring for wounded soldiers, but without adequate medical supplies, treatment options were severely limited. On December 22nd, German forces delivered a surrender ultimatum to the American defenders. The message, delivered under flag of truce to forward American positions, stated that the garrison completely surrounded and faced annihilation if it did not surrender within 2 hours. The ultimatum emphasized the futility of further resistance and promised honorable treatment as prisoners of war if the Americans laid down their arms. The response from Brigadier General McAuliffe entered military legend. When informed of the German demand, McAuliffe replied with a single word that perfectly captured the defiant spirit of the defenders. Nuts. The written response delivered to German representatives stated simply, "To the German commander, nuts, the American commander." When German officers requested clarification of this distinctly American idiom, Colonel Joseph Harper, commander of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, explained that in plain English it meant "go to hell." The refusal to surrender enraged German commanders who had genuinely expected American capitulation. They had offered what they considered generous terms. The American response demonstrated either reckless courage or foolish stubbornness. German forces would now have to take Bastogne by force, which would cost time, ammunition, and casualties that could not easily be replaced. For the German 5th Panzer Army attempting to reach the Meuse River and beyond, every additional day spent fighting at Bastogne represented strategic failure. The morning of December 23rd brought the break that American defenders desperately needed. The weather cleared. For the first time in days, blue sky appeared above Bastogne. American commanders immediately requested aerial resupply. The 9th Troop Carrier Command, which had transported American airborne forces on D-Day and Market Garden, was tasked with the mission. 241 C-47 transport aircraft loaded with supplies prepared for the flight to Bastogne. The C-47 was not designed for combat operations. It was an unarmed cargo aircraft with no armor protection. Flying into a combat zone surrounded by German, anti-aircraft positions required crews to accept enormous risk. Before the transport aircraft could drop their cargo, pathfinders had to parachute into Bastogne to mark drop zones and set up radio beacon equipment that would guide the incoming aircraft. 20 pathfinders from the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment volunteered for this mission. At 6:45 in the morning, 2 C-47s carrying the pathfinder teams took off and flew toward Belgium. As the pathfinder aircraft approached Bastogne, German anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. An 88mm flak gun positioned directly in the flight path opened fire. One aircraft took a hit that punched through the fuselage between 2 pathfinders, standing only inches apart. The pilot, Captain William Crouch, nosed his aircraft down to treetop height and scattered the German gun crew by flying directly over their position. The pathfinders jumped into Bastogne and immediately began setting up their equipment despite continued German fire. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By noon on December 23rd, the aerial resupply operation was underway. The C-47s came in at low altitude, flying through intense anti-aircraft fire. Each aircraft carried 1,200 pounds of supplies in bundles configured for parachute delivery. The supplies included artillery ammunition, mortar rounds, small arms ammunition, medical supplies, rations, and winter clothing. As the aircraft approached the drop zones marked by pathfinders, crews pushed the bundles out the cargo doors. Colourful parachutes blossomed in the clear sky. American soldiers cheered as they watched the supply drop. Recovery teams raced onto the drop zones with jeeps and trailers to retrieve the bundles before German artillery could target the area. The supplies were sorted rapidly and distributed to units most urgently, needing them. Artillery batteries received high explosive shells and were no longer restricted to 10 rounds per gun per day. Medical stations received plasma, morphine, and surgical supplies. Infantry units received ammunition and rations. The aerial resupply continued for 4 hours. 241 aircraft dropped 144 tons of supplies. 14 aircraft were shot down by German anti-aircraft fire or failed to return from the mission. But the operation succeeded. The Bastogne garrison was resupplied sufficiently to continue the defence. Perhaps more importantly, the sight of hundreds of aircraft overhead delivering supplies demonstrated that the defenders were not abandoned or forgotten. Relief forces were coming. They simply needed more time. German reaction to the aerial resupply was fury and frustration. The supply drop proved that American logistics and air power could sustain isolated forces even when surrounded. This capability fundamentally undermined traditional siege warfare. A surrounded force that could be resupplied by air could hold indefinitely as long as aerial resupply continued. German anti-aircraft defences had proven insufficient to stop the operation. While they had shot down some aircraft, the majority successfully delivered their cargo. The Luftwaffe attempted to retaliate that evening. German bombers attacked Bastogne on the night of December 23rd, dropping bombs on the town in an effort to destroy American positions and break defender morale. The bombing killed Belgian civilians sheltering in cellars and destroyed buildings, including an aid station where wounded American soldiers were being treated. 21 wounded men died when the building collapsed on them. The attack demonstrated German desperation but did not alter the tactical situation. The American defensive perimeter held firm. German commanders now faced a critical decision: continue attempting to capture Bastogne or bypass it entirely, and send all available forces westward toward the Meuse. General von Manteuffel had already detached his main panzer formations and sent them westward. But Hitler personally demanded that Bastogne be captured. The town's resistance had become a matter of prestige as well as military necessity. Additional forces were ordered to Bastogne to break the American defence. The climactic German assault came in the pre-dawn darkness of December 25th, Christmas morning. German commanders assembled a powerful attack force for what they intended as the decisive blow that would break through American defences and capture Bastogne. The assault force consisted of the 115th Panzergrenadier Regiment from the 15th Panzergrenadier Division, which had just arrived to reinforce the 26th Volksgrenadier Division. Supporting this infantry were 18 Mark IV tanks, artillery battalions, and self-propelled guns. The attack would strike the northwestern sector of the American perimeter, defended by the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. German planning called for a coordinated attack by armour and infantry that would penetrate American defensive positions, then drive directly into Bastogne before American reserves could respond. Timing was critical. The attack had to succeed in darkness before Allied aircraft could provide air support. If the assault could break through and reach Bastogne by 9 in the morning, German forces would be fighting inside the town where Allied air power would be ineffective. At 5:30 in the morning, German artillery opened fire on American positions around the villages of Champs and Hemrul. The bombardment was intense, designed to suppress American defences before the assault troops advanced. As soon as the artillery fire lifted, German infantry in white camouflage snowsuits moved forward, supported by tanks. The attack initially achieved surprise and local success. German tanks and infantry penetrated American defensive lines and advanced toward their objectives. What happened next demonstrated the effectiveness of American combined arms defensive doctrine. The American position did not collapse despite the breakthrough. Instead, multiple defensive systems engaged the attacking force simultaneously. Infantry fighting positions that had not been overrun in the initial assault opened fire on German infantry with rifles, machine guns, and bazookas. American tank destroyers repositioned to engage German armor. Most critically, American artillery commanders coordinated massive concentrations of defensive fire on the German attack routes. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, positioned near Hemrul, found itself directly in the path of 18 German tanks. The artillery battalion's headquarters was only yards from German armor. Rather than withdrawing, the artillery crews responded by lowering their howitzer barrels to minimum elevation and firing directly at the advancing tanks over open sights. This was not the intended use of field artillery. These were not anti-tank guns designed for direct fire against armor. But the crews had no alternative. They loaded their howitzers with high-explosive shells and fired at German tanks at ranges measured in hundreds of yards. The first rounds struck German armor with devastating effect. High-explosive shells designed to fragment and kill infantry through blast and shrapnel could not penetrate heavy armor, but at close range they could disable tank tracks, destroy external equipment, kill crew members exposed in turrets, and create enough smoke and confusion to disrupt the attack. The German tanks stopped their advance. Some attempted to maneuver around the American artillery positions. Others engaged the howitzers with their main guns and machine guns. American forward observers called for fire from every artillery battery that could range the area. Within minutes, shells from multiple battalions were falling on German positions. The concentration of fire was overwhelming. German infantry could not advance through the curtain of exploding shells. Tanks found themselves isolated without infantry support, vulnerable to American bazooka teams that moved forward to engage them at close range. The mobile reserve that McAuliffe had organized specifically for this contingency now moved forward to counterattack. Sherman tanks from Combat Command B advanced toward the breakthrough. Tank destroyers with their high-velocity guns engaged German armor at longer ranges. Infantry units shifted positions to reinforce threatened sectors. The American defense operated as an integrated system where every element supported the others. By mid-morning, the German attack had completely stalled. Of the 18 tanks that began the assault, none survived the day. Some were destroyed by artillery fire. Others fell to tank destroyers, or Sherman tanks. Several were disabled by bazooka teams that exploited the confusion to approach and fire at close range into vulnerable areas like engine decks and turret rings. German infantry, caught in the open by American artillery, suffered severe casualties. The survivors withdrew, leaving behind equipment and wounded. The Christmas attack represented Germany's last major attempt to capture Bastogne before relief forces arrived. The failure demonstrated conclusively that lightly armed airborne forces, when properly supported with armor, tank destroyers, and especially artillery, could defeat mechanized attacks even under the most disadvantageous circumstances. The American defensive system at Bastogne had absorbed the full force of multiple German divisions and not broken. The relief of Bastogne came on December 26th. Elements of General George Patton's Third Army had been attacking northward from positions to the south, fighting through German blocking forces to open a corridor to the besieged garrison. The spearhead was the 4th Armoured Division under Major General Hugh Gaffey. Leading the 4th Armoured was Combat Command R under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, the same officer who had commanded the 37th Tank Battalion at the Battle of Aracourt, where American Sherman tanks equipped with HVAP ammunition had defeated German Panthers. Abrams's task force fought its way through determined German resistance south of Bastogne. The battle was intense, with German forces attempting to prevent the relief column from reaching the town. But American armor, infantry, artillery, and air power working in coordination proved overwhelming. At approximately 4:50 in the afternoon on December 26th, the 1st Sherman tank from the 4th Armoured Division broke through German lines and made contact with American forces defending Bastogne. The tank was nicknamed Cobra King. The siege was lifted. The corridor that Combat Command R had opened was narrow and under German fire, but it was sufficient. Supplies could reach Bastogne by road. Wounded could be evacuated. The garrison was no longer isolated. German commanders recognized that their opportunity to capture Bastogne had passed. American reinforcements were flowing into the area. Allied air power was now operating continuously in clear weather, attacking German positions and supply lines. The offensive momentum had shifted decisively against Germany. The defenders of Bastogne had accomplished something German military theory had not considered possible. Light airborne infantry, supported by improvised combined arms formations, had held a critical position against multiple Panzer and Volksgrenadier divisions for 7 days. They had done this while outnumbered approximately 5-1, isolated from direct ground supply for most of the siege, in winter conditions, with limited ammunition and supplies. The casualty statistics reflected the intensity of the fighting but also the effectiveness of the defense. The 101st Airborne Division suffered 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, and 516 missing from December 19th through January 6th, when offensive operations to reduce the German salient finally concluded. These were significant casualties but far lower than German forces suffered in their failed attempts to capture the town. German casualties around Bastogne are more difficult to determine precisely as German record-keeping deteriorated significantly by late 1944, but after-action reports and prisoner interrogations indicate that German divisions committed to attacking Bastogne suffered devastating losses. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division, which bore the main responsibility for capturing the town, was essentially destroyed as an effective fighting force. Panzer Division's detached regiment suffered similar fates. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division's assault on Christmas morning cost them hundreds of casualties and nearly all their supporting armour. The psychological impact on German forces extended far beyond casualty statistics. German commanders and soldiers had entered the Ardennes offensive with genuine hope that they could reverse the war's momentum. The rapid initial successes during the first days of the offensive had seemed to confirm that German forces could still achieve decisive victories when properly concentrated. But Bastogne demonstrated the limits of what Germany could accomplish even under favourable circumstances. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.